Okay, so my name is Jonathan Cohn. I'm the chair of the Issues Committee of Progressive Massachusetts. I'm delighted to have with me this evening Marie-Frances Rivera of Mass Budget. If you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what Mass Budget does.
Sure. So my name again is Marie-Frances Rivera, and thank you very much, Jonathan, for having me. The president of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. We're a 30-year-old organization and really focused on research and advocacy around equitable policy solutions for people in the Commonwealth, especially focusing on low-income communities and communities of color.
Awesome. And then, so when I was thinking about kind of important topics to address, the state budget and kind of the economic dimension of our response came immediately to mind. One thing that, just to start off a little bit macro, that I was thinking about earlier today, is that there's this weird way in which people talk about the economy as though the health of the economy and the health of the population are somehow entirely separate things. If you want to just speak to that kind of, that fundamental disconnect that exists in a lot of particularly national rhetoric about the economy.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I think, one thing that we talk about a lot is just like collective well-being. And I don't know, I just really think that it comes, the economy is one thing, but really what we're all striving for is for people to be healthy and happy and for kids to grow up learning and in communities they feel safe in. And our economy and the investments that we make in people are really, that's the goal, really, to have this collective well-being in our communities. So yeah, I mean, if you think about the investments in public health right now, like those investments that we're making in that sector of the economy is really fully just to make sure that people are healthy and are able to lead their lives. So yeah.
And so kind of just thinking about the kind of, as like the legislature gets close to crafting a kind of state budget for the next fiscal year, I saw earlier today that let's see, what was the number, that April tax collection kind of numbers plunged by 2.3 billion. And a lot of, given with all kind of declines in sales and kind of many people being out of work, it's likely that revenue for the state will be down. Can you talk a little bit about what that kind of prospect looks like for the state?
Sure. So, I've been talking a lot about this, and every time I talk about it, the numbers shift and become a little bit more staggering each time. So right now in Massachusetts, about a quarter of our workforce has applied for unemployment assistance. So that's 1 in 4 workers have applied for unemployment assistance. And honestly, that's underscoring the problem, because there are folks that can't, that don't fulfill the criteria to apply for unemployment benefits, such as, including undocumented folks who are out there. So, if we look at just unemployment figures, we know that this is, a monumental problem that we're in right now. And, as people work and, spending less, what's happening is that tax revenue collections are going down, as you mentioned. And some of the work that we've been doing is trying to, use observations from past recessions to figure out like how deep are we really going to get so that we can, if we're thinking about the state budget and government supporting folks at this time that's so necessary, how much are we going to have to work with to really support people in this time that they need it most? And so we've taken some figures that we actually based off of some Federal Reserve Bank figures that show that in this fiscal year, we could have shortfalls similar to what you mentioned of up to $4.5 billion. The next fiscal year, they could be even larger than that, upwards of $7 billion. So it's a huge hole to fill.
So you were just talking about kind of looking at past recessions. What are some of the key things that you think we should learn about the last recession, which like it doesn't even feel like it was that long ago, and many people haven't actually recovered from that one?
No, not at all. Yeah, I was talking to somebody, a legislator out in Berkshire County, that said, my district actually just came out of the Great Recession.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and what we saw in the Great Recession is that there were major cuts to local aid that really are what supports, cities and municipalities all over Massachusetts. And those, local aid contributions from the state, which fund fire, police, roads, have not been increased since the Great Recession. So, we're already starting from a lower starting point, and we really need to make sure that, we're able to support municipalities and gateway cities and places that really need support at this time.
Yeah, because you end up having that like kind of like a terrible ripple down effect that if like the state starts slashing its budget, and then which leads to municipalities start slashing their budgets, and that means layoffs on both levels, and then like the spillover effects of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and municipal revenues are going down as well. So, yeah, it's a cascading effect.
And then just quickly before talking about some of the ways to address that, you're talking about unemployment. And I think it's a great point that you made, that it's likely that like 25% figure is probably undercounting the suffering out there right now, just because of the hurdles that people face in accessing unemployment, or whether kind of formal barriers or even people not sure if they qualify. Do you want to just kind of talk a little bit about kind of some of the limitations in that calculation as a reflection of
Yeah, I mean, in my conversations with legislators, they've mentioned that it's just been really hard for constituents, even who would qualify to get the benefits. So, that's sort of we need to make sure that we're funding the administrative capacities of unemployment benefit offices to support kind of the influx of folks. But honestly, I mean, our unemployment system is pretty robust here in Massachusetts, and the CARES Act, which was the big piece of legislation, the $2.2 trillion package, did supplement a lot of that. It was like the pandemic disaster sort of an additional unemployment insurance add-on that was an additional $600 a week, which is great. But it leaves out tons of folks, as I mentioned before, and undocumented folks really rise to the top as people who are left out of unemployment benefits and a lot of other, direct cash supports that are coming down from either the federal government or even here potentially on the state level.
And I think the kind of one important thing to realize is like that especially with unemployment, is that like they do still pay into this, like they still do pay into the various different systems.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though they can't them. But so one thing I think mass budget has often like been great at is talking about with that there's like that kind of almost long-standing shortfall in state revenue, given like various problematic tax cutting over the years, of what we can do to actually start investing more in kind of in our public, in the collective well-being, in our infrastructure. What are some of the things that you're kind of recommending to legislators now so that we don't end up seeing kind of a bunch of like hasty cuts that end up kind of exacerbating the situation?
Yeah, and I think what we named this session was sort of like staying clear of austerity budgets. Yeah. And there's a moral logic to that, obviously, and there's also an economic logic to that. Because if we're, cutting public workers, if we're, cutting teachers, if we're not fully funding schools, that's really going to lead to ripple effects in our economy, right? But when we do make those investments in, rebuilding or building out infrastructure, or really supporting our students in K through 12 or higher ed, that's really going to lead to a quicker road to recovery than if we slash. So, recommendations that we're making around sort of, yes, there is this looming tax revenue shortfall. We understand that. But we have received some relief from the federal government, to date. We've gotten $1 billion. Previous to the CARES Act, there was a piece of federal legislation that really provided funding for our mass health program, reimbursements for our mass health program. So we've gotten some. The CARES Act had a specific coronavirus relief fund for state budgets, and that was about $1 billion, hopefully, that we're able to fully use for our state budget. And then I encourage people, and I know that our federal delegation is actively doing advocacy around making sure that Massachusetts gets more federal funding, and we should all be doing that. And federal funding that's flexible to really fulfill, the needs that we have. But then, there are a couple of other options too on the state level. One is we have a savings account here in the state, right? It's our rainy day fund, and been putting money into it. It's at $3.5 billion. What we've been saying is it's pouring. So we need to figure out, the smart way of making sure that we're investing that in people at this time. And there are also revenue solutions, homegrown revenue solutions that we can be looking at. And, we have to make choices at this time. Like, do we want to fully invest in, the Student Opportunity Act that was a landmark piece of legislation to fund K-12 schools? Or are we going to have a corporate tax loophole that continues to benefit mutual fund companies? Those are choices that we have to make, right? And so, what we're doing, with partners is just making those choices clear and say, this is a decision-making time. And we believe that in order for us to really have a just recovery, investing in the things that we know we need to make most sense.
And I think that one point
continue to make sense now.
Yeah, I think the one point you made essential is that that this is a choice, that there's nothing inevitable about anything that ever happens with a budget or any policy, that it all stems from past choices and present choices, and that they can just choose differently. Just quickly, so I always like people to explain for people what the rainy day fund is.
Sure. So the rainy day fund, it's also called the stabilization fund. It really is a savings account that the state has. Revenues, especially revenue from capital gains, typically, some of it will go every fiscal year into the state's rainy day fund. And we've done a pretty good job of building that up, which is great because we have that cushion now. But it is still limited. Like the consensus revenue estimates, what they said basically would be kind of the size of the state budget is around $30 billion, and the rainy day fund is $3.5 billion. So you can see kind of the scale of how far that would get us.
Mm-hmm. And so you were just talking about one tax loophole that kind of benefits the mutual funds. How much do we lose each year because of that loophole?
So now you're testing my knowledge. I want to say that so it's called the single sales factor, and mutual fund companies get this. Some manufacturers do, defense contractors. And I want to say it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I forget exactly, like singularly, what the mutual fund company.
If in total, the single sales factor loophole, how much do we lose because of that? Because we don't need to be giving massive tax hikes to the defense companies either. They're doing plenty well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one other revenue option that we talk about as well is that, I don't know if you all remember, but 2017 was when the Trump tax law was put into place, and it was a pretty large giveaway for corporations, but there were some beneficial aspects of it. And some of these beneficial aspects, states coupled to those, so that, from large multinational corporations that were profitable, states would also be receiving some revenue from the profits. Massachusetts has decoupled from some of those, or is thinking about decoupling from some of those positive aspects. One that we recently wrote a paper on pre-pandemic was this thing called GILTI. I think you probably know a little bit about it.
What does that stand for?
Well, a global low tax intangible income. And so it's essentially large multinational corporations that are offshoring some of their profits to subsidiaries, you know, in the Cayman Islands or Puerto Rico, which I recently found out. So guilty. So coupling, you know, what the feds are doing to here on the state level and taxing some of that profit here in Massachusetts for business activities that are happening here could bring in close to $400 million a year here in Massachusetts. So it's a pretty big sum of money. So there are definitely options here on the state level.
And a number of other states are actually like haven't made the decision that Massachusetts has had, right?
Yeah, some states just automatically coupled and they're like, we're going to stay with that.
What other kind of states near any of the states nearby us? I always like saying.
I want to say New Hampshire. New Hampshire definitely pops to mind as one state that remained coupled, but don't quote me on that. I'll get back to you.
No problem.
That's changed.
Like the other states are making a choice, have already made a choice that we could also choose to make.
Oh, sir, yeah. No, there are a good dozen plus states that have coupled to some of these provisions. So.
And on the part of taxes, I know that kind of earlier this year, before the kind of pandemics kind of scrambled everything, you know, Mass Budget as well as Progressive Mass and other members with Raise Up, we're talking about the need of specifically corporate tax, kind of corporate taxes. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the tax ideas that were discussed back then when trying to shape what the House's infrastructure package would end up looking like?
Yeah. So guilty was definitely one of them. There was also an interesting thing that we looked at around corporate tax disclosure, because what was happening at the time when we were doing some of this research is that we actually weren't able to come up with certain estimates because some of the information on you know, the corporate finances weren't publicly available. So we weren't able to do some of the analysis that we typically do on some of these policies. So guilty. We were also looking at the corporate minimum tax, which is essentially if you show no profits for a particular year, as it stands now, a corporation, no matter the size, would pay $456, like $156 in corporate, in the corporate minimum tax. So and some of the information that we did find that was pretty dated, because again, it's not publicly available. More recent data showed that very large corporations were paying $456 here on the state level.
And it's important. And then, so we were talking before about kind of wanting to make sure that the state prevents kind of mass kind of slashing of budgets. It's also actually at this time important to start investing more in the safety net. If you want to talk a little bit, there are many different aspects of this. I know kind of strengthening paid sick time in Massachusetts is an important one of them. If you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we, you know, have passed pretty strong like earned sick days and paid family leave laws here in Massachusetts. And one of the proposals that's, you know, in the legislature now being actively debated is around emergency, you know, adding on so that people have that additional cushion for, you know, sick time, and that the state would go in and pay for that, which I think would be great and is needed. So, because you don't want people going into to work sick, especially time. And you also don't want people having to choose between like putting food, you know, like feeding their families, you know, and going in sick to work. So, yeah.
Yeah, because like nobody should have to make that decision between their job security and the health of loved ones.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like what scares now, that for so many workers, particularly those kind of the essential workers, that's a choice that people are constantly having to make.
And now people are starting to really you know, and I feel like that resonated with people before, but now that we're all like we're linked together. Like if one person, gets COVID that's in the, has COVID that's in the growth, it's now we all are really realizing how, everybody's health really affects everybody else's health, and how it's important for everybody to have protections.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. That like kind of that's that central message of public health is that there's no like one single it's everybody, or it's again like everybody in. You can't have public health without like a holistic framework, and every person's health can affect anybody else's. And so, what are some of the other things that Mass Budget has been that you've been kind of recommending that the state legislature look at to kind of shore up the safety net and make sure that we can kind of do the best that we can to make for collective well-being during such a unstable time?
Yeah, I mean, we're a couple of things we've been working on. Like I mentioned, the Student Opportunity Act, and for folks that aren't familiar, it was really years and years in the making to make sure that there was equitable funding in our public schools around the state. It's a large landmark piece of legislation. It would add an additional $1.5 billion when fully phased into schools every year. And we feel like now, especially as kids are out of school, like learning loss, we know that we need to invest in teachers and schools and kids and families. So now is not the time to say, yeah, sorry, we can't make those investments that we, promised y'all 2 months ago. So that's one of them. We also are working on a piece that we're going to be publishing now around just highlighting the emergency childcare that's being put into place now, and setting up a conversation for to really plan out what the future of childcare is going to look like, because childcare has just been underfunded here in Massachusetts for a long, long time. I was disappointed that in the CARES Act, there was only like $45 million for childcare. So I'm really hoping and advocating for more support for childcare, especially as, whenever people go back to work.
And we have some of the most expensive childcare costs in the country, don't we?
Yes, in the nation, yes. I want to say the average is around $20,000 a year. So yeah, it's really expensive, and our system is really fragmented. So there's a lot of work to do there, and I know there are some good people focusing on that. One of the other items that we've been focusing on is making sure that folks who are left out of direct cash supports are getting cash supports at this time. And there was a bill that was filed around people who file with ITINs, which is like a tax payer identification number, who are left out of those like federal stimulus checks a lot of folks are getting, for there to be a similar type program here on the state level for folks with different documentation status. So those are a few things that pop to mind. Oh, one other thing, a paper that we just recently published was looking at student loan debt. And it's a big burden for a lot of folks. And the CARES Act did some, had some positive aspects of it where it froze certain federal loans for borrowers. But, we said it doesn't go far enough. There are lots of folks who are left out. There are solutions on the federal level and here on the state level that we could be moving forward to really protect people who are vulnerable with like these massive, amounts of debt they still have to be paying during this time.
Yeah, which is kind of wild if you think of like if people's incomes are likely going to be less, and that they shouldn't even have to incur debt to go for higher education in the first place.
Yes.
So many of the systemic problems in our kind of disinvestment in the public higher education system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One thing I was thinking as well, so like I know Governor Charlie Baker recently had his like reopening of the economy task force that he created, and it seemed mainly staffed with a number of, let's say, business leaders in the state. What do you see as some of the, like the limitations in his design of that? Like, what are the other voices that need to be at the table
Mm-hmm.
for us to even have any like legitimate discussion about what it looks like to kind of quote unquote reopen the economy?
Yeah. Yeah, we was pretty disappointed at, I mean, the list just, I mean, if you look at like racial and ethnic diversity, didn't look like it was representative of the state as a whole. And yeah, I mean, I was, talking to some, folks at Community Labor United who are really great partners, and, talking about the lack of union representation, which I think is really important. I was also talking to folks who represent like small businesses and minority owned businesses. There was no representative from that group of folks either. I don't think that there were any teachers or kind of educators on that list
I think there
either.
was one college president, but like nobody representing pre-K to 12.
Yeah. Not to say like there's some good folks on that list, like Mayor Dan Rivera is great, and some other folks, but yeah, not representative of.
Yeah. And so one thing of this kind of reopening discourse, one thing I think has been so important to discuss is the fact that we need to make sure that we come out of this whole thing better and kind of stronger and having invested more in our kind of collective well-being. What are some of the things that you've been thinking about how that rebuilding process, what that rebuilding process needs to entail?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. you know, some of our so we've been having some of these conversations, and there are lots of folks engaged in this work of sort of reimagining what our society and our economy can look like post this, because there's going to be a new norm. It's not going to look the same as before. But some of the things, one story that pops out in my mind that somebody shared with me is, looking at the city of Holyoke and how, in the New Deal sort of era, a lot of the school buildings and a lot of the infrastructure, in that gateway city and in other gateway cities was built during that time. So a lot of the school buildings that we have now. So part of it is, what are the investments in our infrastructure that we need, like to really have a society that works for everybody in 2020 and beyond?
Mm-hmm.
Things like having public broadband. Now that everybody's online, everybody's actually not online. And there's this digital divide that's starting to happen. So how can we step in and really level the playing field for everybody? We know that a lot of our infrastructure is crumbling. We were having 2 months ago a debate about our public transit systems and how our public transit systems needed major investments. There are lots of, our roads and bridges. We still have bridges that are crumbling around the state that are structurally not sound. So there are plenty of investments, that we would likely have to use sort of bonding for, but now would be a great time to prepare, some of that infrastructure and make sure that it fits the 21st century, and that we're, putting people, giving people opportunities to jobs as well.
And I think that's a great point, just in the fact that there are so many needs that were already there before this started, and that a lot of the stuff from the past few months have exacerbated a lot of the needs and a lot of the kind of the inequality existing. But that stuff isn't new. It's kind of gotten worse. But we're way behind where we needed to be on so many fronts to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking, cities around Massachusetts that have seen environmental harms, like economic, environmental, racial, and the way that communities in certain neighborhoods and are faring during this is, it's super troubling, so sad, and the thing is like, let's just get emergency support to those communities right now. That's part of it too, um, just to at least it, have people, I've heard stories about like people not having enough diapers and formulas. It's just, we have to think about the immediate response and also sort of that longer term vision and infrastructure building, et cetera, that needs to happen.
And then, so just quickly, before talking about the budget, and I think the Mass budget often has like wonderful analyses of the budget each year. Can you tell people like what is the timeline likely to be for all of this? If you even have an idea, given how timelines have been scrambled.
I wonder, can I share my screen actually right now? Is that doable? I think I have the up. I can, I think, right?
Might be able to if there's a.
Yeah, I have a little share screen. Oh, the host has disabled. Okay, I can't share. So,
if there's something I can bring up, if it's like I can.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It was just a graphic that shows the state budget process. So
okay, oh nice.
Yeah, in normal years, so we're in May right now. So normal, okay, January, we thought this was going to be a relatively normal year. The governor shared his budget out, and what should have happened was in mid-April, House Ways and Means would have constructed a budget, and the House would have finalized the budget around mid-late April. And right now, what would be happening is that Senate Ways and Means would be constructing their budget, and the Senate would be responding to the governor and the House budget. That's not none of that. The House process and the Senate process has not happened. We've been sort of trying to figure out what is going to happen. But the legislature is trying to figure out, just like everybody else, how we work remotely, vote virtually and things like that. What we've been saying to people around the budget process is that the only thing that actually needs to happen in the budget process is that the governor proposes a budget, and that he has the ability to line item things, and that there is a state budget. So the process within can be recrafted, and at this point I don't have information on exactly how that's going to look, but
I think it's like I know that some legislators have been advocating for doing like a supplemental budget specifically around safety net issues. Do you deem that to be like, whether it's thoughts on that, whether it's likely at all, if it's unlikely but still necessary?
I've heard that that's happening. I think that may be helpful, for some like immediate response sort of things. So it may be helpful, but I think of greater importance is trying to make sure that there's a fiscal 21 budget in place, so that agencies and schools and all the things that we support through the state budget can start planning out their year. It's tough because I understand the slowdown, because trying to predict sort of how much revenue the state's actually going to have is really difficult right now for the following fiscal year. So that's a complicating factor. But the more time that we let lag on, the more difficult it's going to be for agencies and schools to really plan.
Mm-hmm. Especially because, especially when it comes to like the schools, where like the academic year does start in like late August or September. So you really can't the closer it gets to that, the kind of riskier it is for schools.
Mm-hmm.
like for schools, which are also just like a huge
Mhm.
budgeting.
Yeah, and you know, there are options if you know, the legislature feels like it can't craft a full fiscal year 21 budget. So things that have happened in the past are that a 1/12 budget is created. So there are 12 months in a year. So essentially you look at the previous fiscal year and you extend like 1/12 out, you extend it out each month. And so that can sort of help, you know, buy you time to figure out exactly what the full fiscal year will look like. But it really locks you into spending levels from the previous fiscal year. There's also another option that they can do sort of a temporary budget that's a few more months out. Um,
That's kind of like a continuing resolution on the federal level, right?
I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, there are definitely options, and one additional piece for that we've recently found out is that you can actually, I believe, do the budget process outside of formal session.
Okay.
Last that we've understood. So there are options to move the budget process forward.
And then, so what are some things that you would, for let's say for people watching who want to make sure that we can kind of invest in all of this, and that we don't see kind of a really dire looking budget? What are some things that people who are watching this now or later can do?
Hmm. So in order to make sure that we have the money to invest, yeah, I mean, again, I would say number one is more federal fiscal relief. So one thing that the state can't do that the federal government can do is deficit spend.
Mhm.
So they're able to, you know, supply capital to us at a time that we can't really generate it on our own. So really continuing to, you know, work closely with our federal delegation, all of whom are great to really push for having flexible aid
Mhm.
to the state, flexible aid. What's happened with some of the money in the CARES Act is that it's got a couple too many strings tied to it, where it's really difficult to like deploy that on the ground. So flexible spending from the federal government and also supports for workers. Um, and the rainy day fund, as I mentioned, is another option. And revenue options here on the state level that would really ask folks who are benefiting at this time to support all of us, to support our, you know, society and collectively what we do together. So there's one thing that I didn't mention that's sort of a newer option that we're beginning to research, which is a windfall profits tax.
Mhm.
So a business that's doing, you know, extraordinarily well during this time, you know, asking them to support, you know, schools and safety net programs, et cetera.
Which they obviously benefit
Needs
from.
are increasing. Huh?
Which they obviously benefit from.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
So,
the point reminded me of like that we are like, despite let's say the kind of strain on like revenue this year, we still are one of the most affluent states in the country, and we have a lot of wealthy people in the state,
mm-hmm,
which should not be lost on people as we discuss all.
yeah. Wealthy folks, profitable corporations. Yeah. And we also have one of the highest levels of income inequality too. So keeping all of that, that.
Mhm. And so, kind of final takeaways that you would want to give to people watching about some of the messages that you would want to make sure stick with people going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say now is most definitely not a time to be cutting programs and services that support people. People are out of work. You know, kids are experiencing learning loss. We need to make sure that everything is in place and fully funded and supported. You know, as we, you know, get on the road to recovery, whenever that may be. Yeah, and I would say, you know, engage our federal delegation engage our leaders on the state level, and make sure that any funding that comes into the state or the ways in which funding are allocated are done in equitable ways that really support all of our cities and municipalities, especially those that are being hit the hardest right now.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, I want to thank you again for joining us, and thank you again for all of the great work that Mass Budget does. If people want to learn more about Mass Budget and all of the kind of the fascinating research that you continue to and important research that you put out, where should they go?
So you could go to massbudget.org. We also have a Medium blog page that I believe is medium.com/massbudget. You can follow us on Facebook. We're also on Twitter. So any one of those.
Awesome. And I highly recommend people who do like that kind of, who love diving into data, that there are many really fascinating reports to look at that get an important light on many facets of Massachusetts state policy. So
yeah, we're also happy. We used to do physical presentations with folks, but we're happy to also sit down and chat with folks virtually to answer any questions and to get the information out there. So
awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much again, and thank you to everybody who is tuning in now or will watch this later when it's posted on YouTube.
Cool. Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Yeah. See you.